Time for Wine Talks with Paul K.
Fascinating story.
This is Robert Mondavi from the Michael Mondavi Winery.
I taste a lot of wine.
Having a conversation with Shark Tank, Kevin O'Leary.
Michael Silacci, Opus One Winery.
Incredible conversation with Dr. Nia Ruth.
No matter what, you're definitely going to feel better.
Sit back and grab a glass. It's Wine Talks with Paul K.
Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are in studio at the beautiful Southern California, about to have a conversation with Kira. And I'm going to say it wrong. I'm going to say Ballotta, but it's not. Ballotta. Correct?
Ballotta. I mean, I didn't make it up. It's not my name.
I know,
but
that's right. Introductions in just a second.
It was just told to me that way, too.
Yeah. Yeah, he told you. Hey, listen, Wine Talks is available on iHeartRadio, Pandora, Spotify, wherever you hang out for your podcasting, and sponsored by the Original Wine of the Month Club, now supported the Napa and Rosé series of wines. Hey, have a listen. I just had two winemakers in from Italy, two complete opposite sides of the country, completely different grapes, completely different terroir. Fascinating conversation with a Friulian and a Piemontese winemaker, just out on Wine Talks with Paul K. But now while we're here to have a conversation. Our second conversation. Welcome to the show, Kira.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
So great to have you in town, actually. You were here for some just touring, showing the wines.
Doing some nice dinners and some nice tasting events.
Yeah.
I love coming down here. People are so welcoming and they love learning about wine. It's a nice place to be.
Says no one ever about Los Angeles people. Anyway.
Well, I started my career in finance, so I like to say I handle assholes pretty well.
Oh,
so.
yeah. You didn't bring that up the other night. Anyway, Kira is the proprietor of the brands Cantadora and Olivia Brion, which has great history to talk about. But for me, one of the interesting women in the industry, and you came down for the Women in Wine sort of dinner we did Wednesday night, which was really, really fun to be at. And that day was Women in Wine. And you talked about some things. For instance, only 12% of winemakers in America are women.
Well, in California.
In California?
I don't know yeah,
the
about 12. There's 12 to 15% depending on the area. But yeah, it's pretty small, you know.
It's an important subject, and we just put out a collage actually on Instagram of the people that have been on the show, and there was quite a few, obviously women, but of all different parts of the business. But one of the issues that's been popping up is not only is it a small percentage of the winemaking groups, but how about the executives and the marketeers and the people in the industry? It's even a smaller percentage of women.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, I don't know about all of the, kind of C-levels of the different larger organizations, but I know that in terms of winery owners, only about 4% are women. And I think that number shrinks if you consider women, that are 100% owners versus women partners.
Why do you think that is? I mean, this is a question I pose all the time. Why do you think?
Well, I think
there's been headwinds to this.
Certainly financing. I think women are less likely to receive financing, and wine's a very capital intensive business.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't start off with, some kind of seed funding, then you're probably less likely to pursue this as a business. I mean, it's not a very economical business. It's a business of passion, like you've mentioned many times before in your podcast. And so it has to be something that you're just innately interested in and driven to do. And I think that there's the joke, like, how do you make a lot of money in wine? Well, you start with a larger fortune,
yeah, that's right.
And so unless it's like Mackenzie Bezos trying to start her own winery, there's, the number of women that have the opportunity and interest to do that is probably relatively small. So I started out in finance, and, so I come from a background where I can manage and value a business, which is essential in running a business. And then for 10 years, I spent, learning the craft of winemaking, and then kind of brought those two together with my business I run today. And so that is an unusual combination. And then I was going to pursue a degree in winemaking. Instead, I got a job on a winemaking team in Napa, which I spent 4 years on. And I took the money that I was going to spend on my upper tier education and invested in my own business. So we'll see how that pans out. But that was my big risk that I took. And
that's interesting. That's interesting, though. Let's stop there for a second. It's the same in cuisine, where you can start in the kitchen on the line. You can start as a dishwasher, and you can work your way up through the line, and then you can become maybe a sous chef, and then you become a chef maybe, and you've learned it all by the street, basically. Or you can go to cuisine school, and you can learn how to chop onions and all kinds of things, and maybe some basics. And I think it exists in the wine business too. You can be a cellar rat, and just work your way up? Or
I think ideally you do a bit of both, like learning anything, as long as you run the lawnmower over that part of your brain as, many times as possible, you get better at it. Right.
That's true.
And so, my approach was definitely from the ground up, both in the cellar and in terms of coursework. I had a degree in finance, so I had to go back and take chemistry and organic chemistry and microbiology and, in addition to enology and viticulture and those kinds of classes. And so I was taking all of those at Napa Valley College and UC Berkeley, in addition to working, I would work a night shift, for instance, in the cellar and then take classes in the morning, or I would work in the morning in the vineyard and take classes in the afternoon, which I did with my first internship. So just to kind of depending on the course load, I would also take workload. So my first few years in the industry were really busy. It was just taking classes, working, studying on the weekends. I was doing my labs on my work breaks. It was just kind of a psychotic, career transition.
Well, that leads to that big question, and I don't ask this question as a sequence of questions that like some interviews go. It's you've just walked into it, which is why? Why would that? What is it? And you played a podcast a little bit here, which I got to listen to because it was fascinating and it's some subject I'm very interested in. But this is a very ancient product, and it draws us in. And you went from finance, invested your own money to create a brand. What drew you to doing this? Why is this so passionate that you would spend all this extra time?
Well, it was I walked into it pretty slowly, I suppose. I started out in finance, and I got the opportunity to value some wineries with my job in finance.
Okay.
I valued the Stag's Leap acquisition, Edna Valley acquisition, a few others, and I was just really interested in those areas. It was also, it wasn't it was also kind of an edge up at the office I was at, because I worked with a lot of Mormons who weren't interested in alcohol. So it was kind of my connection to my managing director too. I was like, oh, good, I can work on these, fancy wine deals with him. And then I just took this personal interest. At first I was just trying to stand out as a junior analyst. And then I had a friend of a friend who introduced me to a winemaker in Napa who made a little bit of wine, and I would come up and just kind of pepper him with questions and, offer to help bottle or process grapes or wash barrels or, kind of whatever he was doing on the weekends. Small winemakers are always looking for free labor. So it was exactly like,
so am I, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. Quote interns. So yeah, I mean, in finance, everyone has their like eccentric hobby, like golf or something. So I was like, well, I don't like golf that much, so I'll do wine. I'll be the wine geek on the team. But I thought, oh, I don't want to stay in my job if I can't do wine all the time, because I like it so much. And I thought maybe I could be the wine VP at my office. And in order to do that, I would need to get every wine deal, that Gallo produced, and I didn't have the contacts for that. So I thought I'll go work at a big wine company. So I went and got a job in a consulting branch of Constellation, their business analytics division.
Wow, yeah.
And so I worked on their national pricing team. And it was a really interesting entree into the industry, because I did understand all the pricing dynamics of wine, from, wine sold at $5 to, their Mondavi portfolio, and, how to think about, luxury tiers in wine. And so I got this really great top-down look at the industry, but it's still the functionality of my job was still very much, spreadsheets and PowerPoints and day-to-day, that kind of stuff. And what I loved about wine was that cellar experience in Napa. Mm-hmm. And you ask frequently your guests about their aha moment in wine. I didn't have a particular wine.
I stopped asking that question, by the way.
Oh, well, I'm going to tell you the answer anyways.
Because everybody asks the questions.
I'm prepared. No, because I have a different answer. So, I was in the cellar with, and I was tasting a wine that was severely reduced. It had a lot of the, rotten egg characteristics of reduction. And the winemaker took a penny out of his pocket, and he's like, check this out, and siphons off some of the wine into a cup, swirls it with a penny. and the copper binds the sulfurous aromas, and then it's clean. And so I tasted it; it was awful. It was unpalatable. I couldn't
Yeah.
even drink it. And then after connecting it with the copper, it was clarified, and it was like
Wow.
watching a magician or
Never
something.
heard that, yeah.
It was incredible, and I was so hooked. I was so curious and enthralled by this alchemy that I just experienced. And so my love for wine always kind of stemmed from the cellar experience. Coming out of that, I always wanted to, not only how do you produce really beautiful site-specific wine and see it evolve and bottle and barrel and in bottle, but also, all of these different, mechanisms that we have in order to treat and, protect wine from microbial spoilage. It's so fascinating to me.
You said a couple things. I just want to run back. Don't kid yourself. The Mormons, one of the biggest and well-stocked wine shops I've ever been in is in Salt Lake City, and it's owned by the state. And they have everything. They have Opus, Lafitte, down to the Barton's vodka. So I mean, don't kid yourself.
Usually my Mormon colleagues are not interested in the actual consumption of it, but maybe they made some money.
Maybe the
off of
dollar.
it.
Well, the state of Utah does do $500 million in a year in sales. But then you're talking about Constellation Brands, which for the listeners is a very large supplier for liquor and wine, and that you would constitute corporate America in our industry, even in most industries. And it's a different
It's
viewpoint.
the second largest producer, I think, after Gallo.
So they're huge, and corporate America, where I've been to, is a completely different thing than what you're doing here with Olivia Brion and Contadora. And I'm assuming that's not your objective, is to become a Constellation or anything remotely like that. Yours is to present the best you can produce from the things you've been given. And what's very unique, this is going to be probably the bulk of our conversation, and I have this theory about wine, but your love of history seems to be driving what's in this bottle.
Yeah, well, I mean, it definitely drives my appreciation for wine. I think whatever industry I've been, I've always been drawn to the history of it. I studied English. I didn't just study, Toni Morrison. I studied the epics of Gilgamesh, or I was more interested in historical English writings, and I studied finance, and I would read old stock market books that would tell the tales of like the silver exchange in the 1800s. So I've always been drawn to the historical context around the industry that I'm in. But wine is just so fascinating because it is so old. And it does take us through the whole scope of human civilization as we talk about it as such. So it's just, you don't just, when you study the history of wine, you don't start with the 1800s, the 1700s, the 1600s. Right. You go all the way back to the, Sumerians and the first civilizations. And in that way, it's so much more challenging to learn about, but also, forever interesting.
But isn't that defining the ingrained value of a glass of wine in the human soul, going back that far, where it's actually it is one of the reasons why in the podcast you play the gods of the planet, talking about the wine grape being so important to our humanity.
Yeah. Well, I think, like we had kind of mentioned a little earlier today, the way that we consume wine now is just so different than our ancient ancestors. Our ancient ancestors would have drank wine from a large vessel, from an amphorae. They didn't sieve it or strain it or filter it. It was often just kept in that vessel after it got pressed out. So you got a tremendous amount of sediment at the bottom and a lot of kind of spoilage type stuff going on at the top. So you might sit around an amphorae you actually used a giant straw. There's hieroglyphics of ancient Egyptians sitting around with their big straws. And this was ubiquitous throughout even Chinese cultures. You would drink alcoholic grog out of your giant straw. Yeah. And so you would sit around with your big straw drinking wine. And we didn't really know what was in the vessel. If you were at a communal setting like a bar or something, then it was just really up to the barkeep how they stored that wine because it oxidized so quickly into vinegar. So there was recipe books that would circle around that were just like, add this kind of beeswax or this kind of tree resin or this, X, Y, and Z in order to prevent the microbial spoilage, or at least cover it enough to be, palatable. So our understanding and appreciation for wine is so different now that we drink these individual bottles, in identical glass molds with labels that give you a pretty good idea of what is in that bottle, who produced it, how it's produced. You can, my bottles have a QR code. You can read on the back even, more into the detail compared to these people in ancient history that were really, just subject to whoever was caring for the wine in addition to whoever made it. So it's
That's so interesting. Madame Clicquot is credited with labeling stuff, right? They used to just draw on the champagne bottles, and she actually came up with this idea to label. But you said something interesting. Barkeep, one of the great terms of our industry. No one uses barkeep, and it's a great term. I used to have all my homes I've ever built and lived in have a bar. And I love it when people will say, "Hey, barkeep," and it's always the older folks that come to my house for a party or something. They go, "Hey, barkeep, I want to, whatever." I'm like, "That's a great term."
Is it? It is, and one of the oldest wine lists that we have in the world is entombed at Pompeii with whoever was the barkeep, wrote it up on the wall.
I love it.
And they drew some different colored amphoras, and it says, for 1, you can get good wine. For 2, you can get great wine. And for 3, you can get Falernian. And Falernian was this, kind of lauded ancient historical wine that was grown in this one particular area of Italy. And what we know about who would have been able to actually access that wine and consume it, that the wine that was on the list in Pompeii was probably fraudulent. So, it was the first. Also,
that's great. The
so
first Andy,
first
Rudy.
instance of fraudulent. Yeah, the first instance of recorded potential fraud in wine. And
I
then
think
also
they just uncovered one of the more recent excavations at Pompeii. Uncovered a variety store that had either buckets of or this sort of sales counter that had wine in it. I just read this recently. But you said something that's really important too that I wanted to, and it reminded me of my dad's story. My dad was studying pharmacy, but as a kid in Cairo, the one thing that he remembers as he would tell the stories, one, they used to lower down a bucket from the window for the fool guy. The guy would come by with the fool cart, and in fool being fava beans, boiled away. It smells terrible, but it's really good. And then they hoist it up the window. And then as part of that ritual, he'd say, "Son," my grandfather say, "Son, go get a half a liter of dry and a half a liter of sweet." And he would take his fiasco, maybe it was a fiasco then, whatever the vessel was in Cairo, and go to the pharmacy. Mr. Glazinium, I forget, my sister remembers the name, Glazinium. And he would say, "Mr. The pharmacist, can I get a half a liter of sweet and half a liter of dry?" There's no markings, there's no labels, there's nothing.
Just wine, just like
whatever
some
it was,
sweet,
yeah.
some dry.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what they would drink. And so it's not that's not that old. You're talking probably late 30s that this happened. So what you're talking about, this vessel is, pretty new.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have, not that many people know that it wasn't until I think 1865 where it was even legal to sell wine to a consumer in a glass wine bottle in England, because prior to that we had blown glass that was too brittle. It would break. It was a health hazard. And what changed that was the coal furnace. Once we had a furnace hot enough to blow glass mold consistently, then we had the opportunity to really bottle wine. And before that, in 1799, they developed lithography, which was the ability to print over and over on the same piece of paper. So it doesn't surprise me that Madame Clicquot developed her labels around then, because one of her famous vintages, 1812, I think of as being a labeled wine. And that is, we only got lithography 13 years before that. So, right. It's, it all kind of stems back to our ability to bottle and label wine in these quantities, which is such a new phenomenon.
It's kind of interesting because we were talking about women and wine. We're talking about in Champagne. I don't know if people know, but that was not predominantly, but many widowed women ran chateau in Champagne at the time, and were cutting edge in not only logistics and shipping the stuff, but here is Madame Clicquot creating the idea of a label. I mean, that's something we do today. And one of my questions here after we're talking was, I wonder why and where this idea of looking at the label and pontificating over the label became an issue, became something that we desired. It's a marketing issue. Is it a human thing, or wouldn't we just prefer just to open the bottle and pour it and pontificate over what we're tasting, or is this important to have?
Well, we have the oldest instance that we know of as having a wine label is in King Tutankhamun's tomb. There's 32 amphorae, and they all have etchings on them that say, year 5, the year of a pharaoh, it starts the year of birth. So year 5, estate a 10, West River or something like that. Very good vintage. So, they all of the amphorae in his tomb had different etchings of labels. So we always, I think from a historical standpoint, there were several individuals in history trying to label wines. And maybe there was labels that were on wines that just didn't survive, the decay of history. But, I think the importance of labeling wine really probably stemmed from the Napoleon classification, because once we started getting all of these estates with labels and, some sort of ranking, then it becomes this really important marketing factor. And that's perpetuated today.
Do you think that was the death of honest wine?
No, I think that we're in the birth of honest wine. I think that, it wasn't until, like the 1950s, 1960s that we really start getting regulation in California on what you can put on the bottle, and also in other parts of the world, in France and in Spain and Italy, the DOC system or the French, regulatory systems. Those aren't that old. Those are from the 1900s, at different parts and I would even say the back half of the 1900s. And so the idea of this class, this system where you have to abide by these rules and there's some checks and balances, and you can't just put Chablis on a bottle of California Vermentino or something like that, is relative. I mean, you look at the old labels of the original, some of the original post-Prohibition California producers, and it's just all over the map. What it says port, it says Chablis, it's just, these just crazy things. Champagne, of course, is the big debate, right? That we're constantly fighting. But yeah, so it's a really recent thing to have. It's much more frequent, I think, that we had wine fraud, up until now, what there is more regulation.
Good point.
So, no, I think the fact that, in my opinion, we're really at the dawn of the golden age of wine, because we do, we can taste all of these different wines from around the world with some assurance that what we are drinking is what, what's labeled and in the bottle. And so our appreciation of wine is, just so much greater today than it would have been at any other time in history.
At dinner the other night, my wife, who's my biggest critic, especially not only in wine, but everything else. No, kidding. She doesn't listen to the show, so I guess I'm safe.
I'll send her the episode.
Yeah, thank you. But she was like, this is really good. We started with the Pinot Noir that night, and she's like, this is really good. And I said, I told you that, well, like every husband would say, I told you. No, I told you, when I left your house in Napa months ago, even during the conversation, it dawned on me what your approach was to make wine, and it has so much to do with presenting good structure. And then you pour the Tempranillo, and I'm like, wow. And my friend says, this is really good. I said, yeah, but it's a complete departure than the types of Tempranillo you might get in Spain, particularly in the Ribera del Duero, places like that. And here she's created this wonderfully balanced structure with good acid that expresses the grape in a completely different way. And there's intelligence in this wine. And so what I'm getting to is that's not what we see on the shelf. And here you are coming down from Napa. You drove down. That's quite a task. You're going to go to a wine shop today in my neighborhood. You went to a wine shop last night. You had this dinner on Wednesday night. Is this what it's going to take for the general public who wants to learn about wine to understand things like this? Is that we have to just put it in their hands and say, you need to taste this? Like my wife had this revelation the other night.
Well, thank you, by the way. That's very nice compliments about the wine. And for your listeners, I make 2 brands. We didn't even go into them yet, but I make 2 brands. One's called Olivia Brion, and that focuses on different iterations of Pinot Noir, and then also some other varietals. It's a little lighter in structure and a little more robust in aromatics. That's kind of my intentionality around making that wine. And then I have Cantadora, which is a little bit more opulent in structure, like you had mentioned. And I use a lot of different co-fermentations, and my approach to tannin structure is all centered around kind of bringing these different grapes together in order to create a structure that I have in my head that I want to create in the bottle and, make it ageable. I like a structure in a wine that presents really pretty today, but can evolve over time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was lucky enough to work at a big winery where we had a pretty robust budget for tannin research. So I got to learn a lot about tannins in my last 2 years of, kind of a quote unquote industrial winemaking. So I really bring that forward into my wine projects. And Cantadora translates to storyteller. And gosh, I can't, obviously I like to tell a good story. So that's
So
that's a big part of that brand. And all of my labels focus on the stories of women. So Olivia Brion, she's a fictional character, and I like writing as, just kind of a side thing, but each this brand Olivia Brion is kind of like a novel, and each individual wine is a chapter or an adventure in that novel, and that is inspired by the life of a real woman, like the first woman to ride her bike around the world, or the first woman in motorized flight, or the first woman to be arrested for wearing a too small bathing suit, and it was of her own design because gosh, she just wanted to swim.
Sorry, I'm going to stop you there because I wrote in here the other night when I was taking notes as you were speaking to the crowd.
Yeah.
I wrote is there such a thing as a too small bathing suit? So
Well,
coming from a man, of course.
Well, I mean, I guess you can swim nude. It's not illegal, at home.
But she got arrested for
yeah, but she, so Annette Kellerman, who's on my white blend Taquine, she was wanted to be a swimmer, an athlete when, woman athlete weren't words that went together. And it was the late 1800s, and she had nothing to wear in the water that was hydrodynamic. She had to wear a tunic and pants that were often made out of wool, and they were very, heavy in the water. And so to get around that and actually be able to swim, she had to create swimwear. So she cut up men's stage wear and tights and different things in order to cover her body appropriately. And also be able to swim with some speed through the water. So she designed something ultimately that looked a bit like a wrestling outfit that we would wear today, like a tank top and long shorts that were connected. And she was wearing that on the beach in Massachusetts, and she got arrested for wearing an indecent swimsuit.
When was this? What year was this?
That was in 1903, I believe. Okay. And so, but she did get some notoriety from that, and she started a line of swimwear that was successful in the early 1900s called the Annette Kellermans. And she actually ended up in Hollywood choreographing some of the original swim sequences of the early silent films, and appeared as like a kind of a nude, like a mermaid in a film. And she was a very early, person to do that. And she had this really fun, kind of exciting life outside of really being a trailblazer for women. And I was a swimmer in high school and a swim coach later. And so, it's a nice little tribute for my history too. She really allowed me to be a swimmer as a woman,
Well, for all the men in the world, thank goodness she got involved. But how do you find these stories? Because you also tell the story about I think it's a woman on this bottle.
Yeah, the Pinot that we're having right here, this is about the first woman to ride her bike around the world.
Yeah.
So that was the original label for Olivia Brion, and that was based on the life of Annie Chomsky. She was a Latvian immigrant to the United States, and she I don't really know what her inspiration was for starting to ride a bike. She only had 3 days of cycling experience, evidently on a 30 or 42-pound Columbia bike, before she started riding her bike from New York to Chicago, and drummed up enough interest in her story to get a water company to sponsor her ride around the world that she had just endeavored upon. And so she changed her last name to Londonderry to advertise Londonderry Water Company as she rode around the world. And in fact, she's known in history as Annie Londonderry. So, it was a big commitment at the time. I call her the earliest influencer, but she and then she got a couple guys to bet her $10,000 that she wouldn't finish this ride around the world. And she just rode back to the shore in New York and got in a boat and, checked into all the American embassies on the way around the world so that she had proof, and then came back and collected. And at the time, it was about 3 years' salary for the average guy.
That's amazing.
So it was just.
How'd you find that
like,
story in the first place? I mean, how do you find these stories?
Well,
that you decide to honor them?
once people know you like women historical stories,
Oh,
you will get a lot of them. and I, they're really easy to find online. And there, there's several different sites that you can look at and get inspiration from. And I keep kind of a running list of stories that, that I would like to include. One of the stories I haven't done yet is the stories of the spies in World War II and World War I that were women, and they have really phenomenal stories. And I always wanted to do kind of a spy label, so maybe someday. But my next label that I will launch in April is my rosé of Pinot Noir from the Santa Cruz Mountains.
Wow.
And it highlights the first woman ship captain. And her name was Eliza Thorold, and she, like you had mentioned, was a widow. A lot of women that were entrepreneurial were widows, and they just had to, take care of their family. And she was, her husband died very suddenly of actually a knitting needle stuck into his hand when he was playing with his kids, and he died of blood poisoning from that. And yeah, I know. I'm just so grateful I live in the age of penicillin.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But which was also developed by a woman, by the way. There is like the original the strain of penicillin that gets used ubiquitously was developed by a woman who discovered it after the original discovery. But so he passed away. She has 5 kids to take care for. He was a ship captain. He inherits she inherits from him this 44-foot tugboat that was on the San Francisco Bay.
Yeah.
And it's Dame Marian and Ethel is the name of the boat. And she in order to have a business on that boat, she has to have a licensed ship captain on the boat, and that would have taken all the proceeds from the business trying to pay that ship captain. So she goes and just applies for a ship captain license, and you had to take a test. And the paper interviewed her because I don't even think she was aware she was the first female ship captain. She was just trying to make ends meet.
Just make it work.
Yeah, and they interviewed her, and she just said, the circumstances are such that I have to become the master of my own boat.
There's a quote in there somewhere.
Yeah, there is. And so she's the first female ship captain, and she has that is kind of a famous quote for her, and I probably botched it a little bit, but yeah,
that's close. But that's these stories are inspiring and interesting, and that you're sort of perpetuating the story by putting the brands in there. How does that resonate? Let's talk contemporary marketing. How is those ideas resonate? Because you were very passionate about telling the stories the other night, and here we are with rather loud restaurant, 40 people, 50 people, they're having their own good time, and you're telling a real story about a real interesting thing. How is it resonating with the public in general to have these stories?
I think telling the Olivia Brion stories, people connected with them, and they really liked the historical stories. And I think that gave me the confidence to do the Cantadora label because, I was selling wine to people in oil and gas or pharmaceuticals or all different industries, different, backgrounds, political viewpoints, all this stuff. And I found that people really did connect to a story from wherever they were coming from. And so the stories that I'm passionate about are the stories of women today. And so that experience with telling those stories of Olivia Brion is kind of a training ground, so to speak, allowed me to really, explore the stories of women doing phenomenal things for our community that are addressing real issues like, domestic violence or generational trauma or, socioeconomic divisions and whatnot, because, I highlight an economist, an artist, and a social worker activist who is addressing all of those issues on my labels for Cantadora. So and I do have a very different relationship with the consumers I sell Cantadora to, because when we start talking about these stories, there's always immediately a deeper personal connection. So, it's been, it felt like a big risk. I was a little nervous, I think, when I first started doing it, but it's been such a tremendous payoff for me personally, just, my enjoyment of telling those stories and, inspiring others with the tale of people doing something very effective and innovative to address these issues that we have today.
I think there's two things going on here. One is when you said the dawn of the golden age of wine. If you walk through the markets, you wouldn't agree with that because of what you see there. But at the same time, I feel, in the marketing standpoint, it's a different subject entirely, but the marketing of wine is in this very tricky position right now in the world because of the internet and because of social and all the rest of the things that go on, that the dawn of the golden age of wine is really what you're doing. Is really, we're going to have to tell these stories, and the stories have to come along. But you can't just tell a story. Like, there are stories from Napa that are like so trite and silly that it's like big deal.
Right.
I am to say a big deal. I named my vineyards after rock songs. I mean, that's not a story.
Well, and also, like, like whatever you do put on a wine label, you have to talk about ad nauseum. And I just, if I put my name on the label, I would have to talk about me all the time. And that's just not nearly as interesting to me personally as these other women. So
it's kind of like watching a wine show, which I'm writing a new one, and it's about these stories, the stories you're talking about. Because almost every wine show you ever watch is about the host. I'm a master of wine. I'm a master of somm, and I'm here in the vineyard. And here's a drone that flies through the vineyards. I'm like, who cares? I mean, who cares? So this dawn of the golden age of wine is going to be about the storytelling, and you're onto it. But there's also the second part is what you put in the bottle has to tell the story too.
Right. Well, you can't tell a good story without good wine.
Right.
So
it's impossible.
Yeah, you like, you're not interested in the story if the wine sucks. That's just what it is. So if I wasn't, if I didn't have experience in the craft of wine, making wine, and a vision for the wine itself, and really great partnerships with growers, and a great reverence for organic farming in all of its forms. I think all of that goes into the bottle and shines, and that allows me to tell these additional stories. So it's in
its most basic way, at my table, which is my wife and our two close friends that live nearby, that was obvious. My friend loves to scour the internet, look for wines that are recommended. We're going to talk. Maybe we won't get to the points thing. That'll take us for an hour to talk just about the point system. But
let's talk about the point system.
Yeah, okay, we'll do it right after this comment. But that's what he buys on, and he's got a little cellar, a little collection of things. He always brings these sort of 95-point wines to dinners and things. But he was fascinated by your wines, and he's like, "Where can I get these?" I think he asked you the question when we came to the table. And these are a departure from these opulent, fruit-forward Napa wines that that I have a hard time drinking sometime nowadays because they're such interesting structured wines as yours. But okay, let's talk about it. That's what he buys. He gets on the thing and he sees a Suckling 95. And my comment always is, and if you obviously listened to the podcast a couple of times, you probably heard this, which is, man, if I buy a 95-point Napa Cab, that's completely different than 95-point, Tempranillo from Mendocino. That's a different wine completely. And so I may be disappointed in one, but they're both 95s.
Well, when I talk to people, especially consumers, about wine, and really my goal when I give tastings or virtual tastings these days is, of course, to share the wines and the story, but I don't really drone on with pictures of the vineyards or drone shots or that kind of thing. I like to just enhance people's overall appreciation of wine, and so I do it with these stories of like, this is, this was the historical context of wine, and this is how my approach to pairing wine is, and this is some winemaking 101, just so you can be familiar with the process of winemaking. But, so when I approach people about what they like about wine, I don't ask them necessarily, do you drink a lot of Cabernet or do you drink a lot of this or that? I say, what do you like about red wine? And it's a more difficult question to answer, but it's more informative. So if someone says, well, I really like fruit flavors, or I really like a bold, mouthfeel. And sometimes I ask them how they take their coffee. That gives me some direction too. If they take their coffee black, they generally like a lot of tannin. If they take it with milk, they're more, diverse in range. If they drink frappuccinos, I'm just like, okay, well, I'm going to send you to the port producer down the street. Yeah,
right.
But
that's funny.
but those leading questions kind of help me evaluate their taste a little bit, so I can say, well, I think you might like this wine that I make, and this is why, rather than, and all my wines are, they're rated 92 points pretty much across the board by Wine Enthusiast. So I do, I have Jim Gordon score them, and I haven't gone more extensively to, the other reviewers, because I am relatively new in terms of these brands in the industry, and you do have to pay to be on those sites, whereas Wine Enthusiast does it for free, which I think is important for people to know, because most people just think, if you haven't been scored by James Suckling, it's because your wines aren't good. Well, it's because you haven't paid him yet.
Yeah.
So
that's a very important part of what this point system, and it wasn't always like that. In fact, when you talk to some of the older folks in this industry, the Bartholomew Broadbents of the world, whose father was Michael Broadbent, the famed English critic, Harry Waugh, that era, Nathan Croman of LA Times, they didn't do that. It was really the value of that glass of wine, and
well, you don't pay for the score, but you do pay,
you
pay.
Yeah.
You have to subscribe at a certain level and stuff.
Right? He's got to pay tasters, and
right.
In fact, he's supposed to come on the show, because last time I saw him at an event, I said, "Let's talk about. I want you to come on the show and defend the point system and how you do it."
Yeah,
he's got 6 tasters, and how you get some baseline. Like, for instance, when I travel, I don't use Yelp or Foursquare or any of those food apps, because it's somebody else's opinion. I do use the Michelin app, which has not only the starred restaurants but recommended restaurants, because it's one organization and one standard.
No, I like using a tire company for food recommendations too.
You can. Yeah, but there's a reason why.
I know.
It's a tire
I'm kidding.
company.
I just like the history of it.
They wanted people to drive around and wear their tires down. You know that none of the restaurants in the first group were in Paris. They're all in the suburbs.
Yeah.
So
no,
I'm
familiar with the history of this.
Good.
Yeah.
So the point I was going to make was, okay, so you were talking about co-fermentation and some of the processes you're using to create these interesting structures in the wine. But really, is that to tell the story of the wine inside, or is that to, and I have three opinions here. One would be, is it to make it more expressive, or is it the palatability of it for the broad market, or is it relative to the terroir to best express where they're coming from, in your opinion?
Well, I make wine, one, to express the terroir, but two, I maybe take more liberties than the average winemaker. But I don't think I do, actually. I think most winemakers approach it this way. They just don't talk about it per se. Is I do have an idea of the structure that I want the wine to take, and I know that if I give the wine, I know what I'm talking about is the silky mouthfeel, really elegant mouthfeel that people enjoy, that I enjoy, that's very, it's just a fun, weight on your tongue. Right. Sure. So, in order to achieve that, and I don't work with Cabernet Sauvignon, but most of my training is in Cabernet Sauvignon, and I apply that to these other red varietals. So I look at the tannin structure of that varietal on its own. For instance, the Healer from Cantadora is 80% Mourvèdre. And what I like about Mourvèdre is...
no one ever.
Right. What I like about Mourvèdre, I like it for the earthiness of the fruit. It has this real interesting richness and earthiness. And I think it's a real California grape, even though it's from the Southern Rhone. I think it expresses California really well. But it tends to finish a little bit gritty, a little unrefined. And so what do I know? I know that to temper that, I need a lot of anthocyanin and the color molecules in wine to be presented to that tannin in order to bind it and create a silkier mouthfeel. So what I do is I do a co-fermentation with Syrah, which has a tremendous amount of anthocyanin. And if I present that at the grape stage, that is my most effective way of creating those polymers between the tannins and the anthocyanin. So I am constantly kind of trialing these things I have in my head in the winery. So I don't just do, I generally don't just throw all of my, eggs in one basket, so to speak. I usually do control trials if I have enough grapes for it. So I'll do 100% Mourvèdre fermentation, and then a co-fermentation with Syrah, and then Syrah on its own. And then I'll test that co-fermentation hypothesis that I was testing over, harvest after, the malic fermentation, and see, is this blend at this point different than the co-fermentation blend with similar percentages, and then learn from that. And that guides me in my winemaking going forward. And, and a lot of that is, things that have been done in history, like historically in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, there is a lot of different co-fermentations that they do employ. And so, but, California having a totally different terroir, I use some of that information of, a longer winemaking lineage and test it in California. So
this is a really interesting question for me because I've wanted to ask it, and you just laid it out there, which is how do you control? And maybe it's a little too granular for a podcast, but how do you control the other variables that could influence that decision? In other words, you're trying to restrict the variables to one or two things that the way you're having the polymers attract all those things that happen. Is it possible to restrict the rest of the variables that make those two barrels the same, except for the one thing you're trying to test?
You're always going to get some variation in that. You can kind of taste test that over multiple barrels, to see if they're, if the same dynamic holds true. So it definitely informs you. If, I found there's differences in neutral oak barrels, there is some variation between them, in addition to, of course, the new oak. So yes, it's difficult. You're right, to have a real control in that situation. That's an apples to apples, but you can kind of taste and isolate over several barrels the differences.
Yeah.
And so, and attribute them to, maybe just that polymerization between those tannin structures rather than, anything else. And so you have to take the time to taste every single barrel, which I do, and then when I'm really evaluating these trials, I do taste them barrel to barrel.
It's like I said, you're young, and
well, I'm 36.
Wow, I didn't even ask it. I got the answer. But you don't, you get. They say 40 years is a pretty good career, which would be in general 40 vintages. Maybe if you travel to South America, you got a few more vintages under your belt. But
yeah,
that's not a long. It's only 40 tries, so
right.
you're making efficiency out of testing these ideas, and the idea eventually is to produce a wine that best expresses your opinion of
the site. Well, I mean, I argue that outside of maybe like a really hot fermentation, or, there's a few different winemaking techniques that I think can really change the dynamic of a site. But I think within a certain confined range of winemaking techniques, the site is going to show through. And I do that with, the most site-specific grape, which is Pinot Noir. So I'm able to do more of this the higher yield I have for my site. So I had a really big yielding year in 19, which is the vintage we've been tasting on this trip. And so I got to really, play as a winemaker with a lot of different trials because of that yield. Whereas other yields, the last two yields have been very low. So I've had to use lessons from that vintage to really inform my winemaking in the last two vintages, where I had a very small amount of opportunities to make wine. So the 19 Pinot Noir, I used a 50% whole cluster in one fermenter, 30% stem addition in one fermenter, and then I had a control of crushed berries in one fermenter. And then I was able to really analyze the tannin structure of those different tannin usages of the stems over the course of aging. And I will say that there is like some slight variation in the tannin structure, and there is a little stemminess in some of them that does evolve into some spice notes, but overall the site comes through each time. So it's, it's within that range where I would still consider it a very site expressive wine. And so I play within those parameters.
We went to dinner the other night with one of the great negociants of the south of France. I think they admitted they were 79 or 80 now. Melvin Masters and his wife, they make Charmel, and they make a brand. They invented the brand Les Gemelles. They make a brand called Tortoise Creek. They're all negociants. Fabulous couple, English, but they lived in the south of France for most of their career. And I was so impressed with myself. Says no one ever, but because I'm with him, and this guy's a really polished wine guy for many, many, many years. And we were at a restaurant in Santa Monica, and he says, pick a wine. And I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to pick? And a very eclectic list, French, Italian, whatever, in a very sort of contemporary restaurant cuisine. And I picked a Norella Mascalese from Sicily, and they poured it. And he smells it. He goes, oh my God, and there's this terroir, because the Etna volcano just produces this amazing character in the nose and the terroir. And that's what I think wine should be. It should be expressive of something.
Right.
And that's all these processes you're doing are to deliver that.
Right. And I think I think there's a little bit of a confusion, I'd call it, with consumers in that, there's all these terms being thrown around like, natural wine or dry farm wine or all this different stuff that really just like, doesn't really help us very much because it just presents a lot of confusion. But, wine as an entity is not a natural product. It's made as a craft by somebody.
Right.
And, because grapes don't fall on the ground and produce wine, they produce vinegar. So someone has to control the microbial spoilage for it to taste anything like wine. And so so I think that sometimes people think of, you don't want to, intervene in the winemaking, but in order to make wine, you have to intervene. So I get kind of frustrated with these sort of umbrella terms that discount the impact that a winemaker can have on expressing that site. For instance, for the Pinot Noir, I made it, the first vintage I made, my Russian River Pinot Noir in 18, I kept it as classic to California winemaking as possible. Like I tried to, just channel Joseph Swan or something and make it exactly like that. So just a really light touch, just all destemmed fruit straight into the barrel for 2 years, go through slowly through malate, come out, bottle it, and just try to keep it as true to, that sort of light touch winemaking as possible. And when I tasted the wine, I thought, I really want to bring out the structural components of this site more. And so that's when in the 19 vintage, I start to expand, how I bring out the tannin structure of that site. And also that growing season, which was a long, cold growing season and produced some nice lignification on the stems, which, is the kind of the woodiness on the stems that produces some more, spice notes in the tannin rather than just simple kind of green notes in the tannin. So, it just depends on the year. So I think, showing some of that lignification is showing that vintage, is showing that site, is creating that variation that's important to taste in wine. So
I suppose that's been the objective of the ages. The monks who didn't have all the chemistry to work with in Burgundy, but they certainly were able to determine which parcels of land were producing the bit more interesting grapes, and that
they were pretty advanced. I mean, even some of the earliest pottery shards we have of wine has the biomarkers of not only tartaric acid, the predominant acid in grape wine, so that we can identify it as, a vessel for grape wine, but it also had tree resin from the terebinth tree. So we knew that, even the earliest pottery shards, it was a pretty advanced industry already because they were using a tree that was known for antimicrobial properties. So it was used on wounds or to chew, to prevent toothaches or for a variety of maladies. And they were using it in wine to prevent microbial spoilage. So even the ancient winemakers were using, any technique they could in order to prevent that wine from turning to vinegar.
Which would be the next thought would be they're still trying to produce the best they can produce, whatever technologies they had in testing like you're testing, in order to produce something of value to society, which to me is one, you already brought it up. We'll make it a sort of a colloquial phrase, which is wine should be an expression of time and place. So you were talking about the terroir, you're talking about the weather, you're talking about those. This is what I want to taste, and it needs to mean something to me. And there's so many stories to tell throughout history of a bottle of wine or a vintage of wine or a place that had an amazing emotional consequence to either a group of people or a person that kept them from different evils that may have resulted from them not understanding the value of a glass of wine.
Well,
that make any sense?
Well, I mean, like in addition to water spoilage, right? There was a lot of just like, adding wine to water.
Actually, I'm going to show you a poster before you leave today, which is from Béziers in 1939. It's a fabulous poster that was posted throughout the town in the south of France, but we won't talk about it now. But there's a conversation, I brought it up before the podcast, you may have heard it, and it's a fabulous question. And it's only almost an hour almost. One of the issues was in Burgundy during the AOC meetings, one winemaker said, I don't think it should be in the AOC rules that we can't advertise. And if we were to eliminate the marketing of wine in the sense of what you see today on the shelves, it's just strictly the value of what's in the glass. How different would the wine industry be that it was based on that, and you couldn't tell people about it? People had to come, in other words, build a better mousetrap kind of thing. Or the idea that amongst all the other variables that we remove the profit requirement of wine to make wine, and that we could produce what we want to produce, and would it be a different industry?
I think it does eliminate the smaller players if if you put those constraints on us, and online marketing and reaching consumers in a variety of ways has definitely enabled small producers to continue. So I think
That's a good point.
And even the most recent study on wine delineates the health benefits of red wine, which we know throughout history there's a tremendous amount of health benefits in red wine related to the anthocyanins, but also the formation of the alcohol. And but the most benefits came from a diversity of wine. So rather than just drinking like your favorite Cabernet every night, people got more benefits the more types of wine that they were consuming. We don't know why. I don't think that we know why. And that's sort of the fun mystery of this, ancient elixir, right? Is it keeps revealing new questions, new answers to us over time. And, when people say, when are we going to just create wine in a lab? I don't think that that's anywhere in the future, because we don't know enough about wine to put all the inputs into the computer to create a wine chemically, because that requires all the zeros and ones, kind of a binary definition of, creating something. And we don't have all those zeros and ones. We cannot predict exactly how a wine will form and change over the life and bottle. It still is,
Wouldn't that be sad if the lab says we're making a Bordeaux today because we think we know all about Bordeaux, we're going to create a character?
Well, it's sad, but because of our history with it, but it's also, I think, unlikely, because we don't have all the information that's needed to create all of the elegant intricacies of, a Bordeaux. So
it's the beverage of the ages. There's nothing like it. There's nothing that attracts people to it. And this is my hope and my philosophy on a glass of wine. And we go through these marketing trials all the time, and the different generations, the millennials aren't drinking, and Gen Zs and Xs and elemental Ps, whatever they're doing. But eventually, and this is more of the aha moment part, is I believe that good glass of wine will find its place home with all the generations eventually, because it cannot be disrupted in the sense of what it brings to the soul of a person and the connection to the earth and the things that have gone through your mind when you're making the wines. Nothing else can do that. White Claw can't do it. Bourbon can't do it. Nothing can do that.
Yeah,
and I think
beer
that's the
doesn't
hope.
do it. It's you can always replicate a recipe for beer. You can. There's no recipe for wine you can replicate.
Right.
So I think that you can try, but every growing season is going to thwart those efforts for sure.
Which is great.
Yeah, it is.
It's important.
And so I try to, as a maybe a younger person in the industry, certainly as a winery owner, I really try to impart that on other young wine drinkers, just a greater appreciation for the ancient history of this, how it's evolved, why what we're drinking today is so phenomenally interesting and different. And be open to that as, a part of your life and the enjoyment of the beverage. And I think there's been a lot of backlash on alcohol in general, which I can't, is part of our history too. It comes and goes with, the prohibition, that was a thing that did happen in our country. So, it's not exactly,
it's not gone.
Exactly. It's not exactly surprising.
There's 50 versions of it. That's
right. All. Exactly. But, there is a lot of, you go back to the original, you take the Hippocratic Oath as a doctor. Hippocrates was a big proponent of wine as part of a diet, kind of the foundation of the Mediterranean diet. So there's proven health benefits throughout history for moderate consumption of red wine and a diverse array of red wine, and like you were saying, in terms of medicinal properties, they wouldn't recommend just one wine for one malady. They would recommend a sweet wine for this, or a white wine for this, or a red wine for this. So, it's very, very unique in terms of how we have evolved as humans, and the expression of this beverage, and the how it contributes to our life and our health.
Well, since you brought that up, And we're already on an hour, so we're going to wrap this up. And I'm going to ask you this question. This is my fun part of the show. I ask this question to everybody that comes through. It's harder for the Italian group because all the answers are French districts of wine. So it's also sort of like, it's kind of like the Master Wine test, the Master Somm test, or any of those tests along the way. You're interested in the reason for the answer as much as the answer. Because really, if I went through all my shows, I would probably get I'm going to give you 3 choices, and probably 33.33% of the people got it right.
Okay.
Okay. So from what was written by Dr. Murray, who was a French doctor in the 70s, he was also a homeopathic doctor as well as an MD, and he wrote this book. And since we're talking about the health benefits in the Mediterranean diet, which here's the book right here, the French Paradox. Let's choose fever. And so if you have a fever, you should try and drink either a Grave, which would be a Cabernet-based Bordeaux, a Muscat, or a Provence Rosé in the same category, or dry Champagne. Which one do you think would benefit a fever? And why is the big question.
Fever. Well, I guess I would err on the highest alcohol percentage in order to get the highest antimicrobial benefit from it. So I would go with answer A, Grave.
The Grave.
I would go with the red wine, but it's also dehydrating, so
yeah, that's a good point.
yeah, so so then you might,
All right.
but that would be maybe my first inclination. I am also biased because I just was listening to this study on like old cholera and how people that were drinking wine were less susceptible to cholera because of the antimicrobial benefits.
Okay, well, I think that was good, but the answer was champagne.
Champagne. What is
here's
it
what
about
it
champagne?
says here. This is Dr. Murray says that why a dry champagne? Why? Because these wines contain, among other things, 2 important elements for a feverish person: phosphorus, which is eminently stimulating, and sulfur in its sulfate of potassium form, whose detoxifying action on the body has been established. And you were talking about basically antimicrobial detoxification was the answer. Okay,
Yeah.
so if now you know the answer to that, what do you think the dosage should be? How much champagne should you have if you have a fever?
I don't know, two glasses?
I'm sorry, it's a bottle per day. So that's okay.
Well, I'm gonna try
So I'm
that.
looking forward to my next fever. It's been such a pleasure to have you again, and I'm sure we could do it again and again, and just to continue to uncover new and interesting subjects, and as you continue to study this incredibly interesting and fascinating subject of wine. But more power and luck to the brand.
Thank
and we
you.
hope to see you again.
Find me online. I love to
Yes,
hear
go
from
ahead.
wine lovers or consumers. I'm at Olivia Brion, Brion Wines is the social media handle on Instagram and Facebook. And then on Cantadora, it's CANTADORA.wine is the website, and Cantadora Wine is the social media for it. And I love answering any questions and talking about stories and hearing about your tales of women or wine. And it's only me. I'm the only person. So all roads lead to me if you find me on the website or find me online. It's just me.
Well, and there's your husband and your kids. And
Well, they don't answer my DMs.
so
I mean,
Olivia,
maybe my kids will start eventually, but
that's a whole nother subject we have to
that's
talk about.
another subject. But they're for now they're 3 and 5, so they're
working
not
on
on
it.
social media.
Olivia Brion, BRION.com in Cantadora with a DORA, Cantadora.com.
.wine. It's the new version
.wine.
of .com.
Oh.
I have Cantadora.wine, and then Olivia Brion is the old brand, so it's .com.
Wow.
Yeah.
Huh, I've never seen that. Okay, great. Again, travel safe today and tomorrow, and I'll probably see you tonight at the bottle shop in Sierra Madre just to have a glass of wine and say hi to some old friends.
Good. That sounds great.
Cheers.
Thanks for having me on.